So, death is special theologically. Jesus, according to the New Testament, died for our sins, but everybody dies. And, there are some people who claim pretty strange things. Although I will tell you this, do you know that not one founder of a major world religion claimed to be God? Not one other founder? That might surprise you. Because you kind of get this idea that all religious founders probably claimed something like that. But none of them did, as far as we know. All right, still, people can say, Charlie Manson said he was Jesus Christ. Right? So people can say things. But the resurrection is the real breaking point here, because the resurrection is what it claims to be. And now you start to talk about, well, what do I do with this guy? So I'm trying to settle on something here that I think makes the grade historically. That's why I try to argue my dissertation. But I think it's more than that. I think it anchors Christianity. So what you do with Christianity stands or falls with what you do with the resurrection. Okay. Real quick word about history, and then I'm going to dig in. When you do history, especially when you do ancient history, two things you need to deal with are, I call them tools and rules. You have to have data, and you have to know how to use that data. It's like saying, I'm a gardener, so I have a shovel, I have to know how to use the shovel. You have to have historical data, and you have to know how to use data. And when you use historical data, you just don't want any old data. I mean, it doesn't really help to have sources that are way, way after the events. I mean, this might surprise you, but you know that the best known biography of Alexander the Great, is written about 400 years after Alexander lived. Now that won't cut it for us today. That's sort of like saying the best I Was There book for the American Revolution has not been written yet. It just doesn't seem to really have a lot of clout unless you're interviewing people in that book, people who were back there. We want people who are in the right place at the right time. Just keep those two in mind. That's just the beginning of some of the tools we need to use. Right place, right time. And what we're saying there is you want somebody who's got data, and you want the data to be early when you're doing history. Doesn't help to have things that are way, way, way after the fact. Okay. So the method I'm going to use with you today is what I call a minimal facts method. I am not going to cite things just because Christians or anybody else agrees with them. I'm only going to use data that make the following two tests. They fulfill the following two tests. Test number one, no matter who you are, assuming you're a scholar who works in this area, no matter who you are, scholarship across the board will accept the facts I use. At least for the most part, I will mostly use data with you today that 95 to 99.9% of all scholars accept. And it's irrelevant whether the person you want to pick out is a conservative, a moderate, a liberal, an agnostic, or an atheist. They will concede the vast majority of the facts I'll use tonight. All right. So I'm not going to use facts which are true because the Bible told me so. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad reason, but I can't just start with that conclusion, right? I want to build up to that conclusion. I'm not just going to start with it and say, well, if you all grant this book, then I can make this message tonight. Because a lot of you are going to say, sorry, I mean, I'll listen to you, but I'm not going to grant your book. So let's start with basics. Let's deal with minimal data. And I'm going to use facts, which virtually all scholars accept. Now, there's a more important reason than everybody accepts them. And that is, why does almost everybody accept them? If you get Democrats and Republicans agreeing on something, there's probably a pretty fair reason why they're agreeing. And if virtually all scholars, New Testament scholars, theologians, philosophers, and historians who deal with this, the reason they almost all agree with this is because the backup for these facts is really strong. They don't want to tangle with the backup. So really my first reason is each fact I use will be evidenced by several backup facts. And that's why almost everybody agrees. Does that make sense? And I'm going to share that. Now, you know, somebody, every once in a while I get a question like this. Well, how do you know what everybody believes? I mean, who made you the spokesperson? And there's an easy answer to that. It's not easy to get the answer, but it's an easy answer. I know that the vast majority of scholars agree with these facts because I counted. And I went through basically everything in print on the resurrection the last 40 years, French, German, and English. And I counted. And I put a document together where all I do is line scholars up in what they admit. The document alone with no commentaries over 500 pages. So, I mean, it's a silly kind of response, but every once in a while in a debate or something, someone says, well, how do you know? And I'll say, I counted. How do you know? And you don't find too many other people who want to count these things. So challenge me on one of these if you want, that's fine. But let me start this way. Let's go down here. Most of this lecture, I have a PowerPoint, but as I told the guys, I don't like to use a PowerPoint in this one because you're going to either have a choice of watching the PowerPoint or watch what I'm doing down here. And I want to map out my whole argument by doing a timeline. And the whole timeline, except for some things I'm going to say here at the beginning, the whole timeline only takes place over 25 years. It's very brief. Let's call this down here, I'm going to call this ground zero. This is the death of Jesus. And give or take, I'm some disagreement about the exact year, but that's not important. Let's say the year of Jesus' death is about, give or take, 30 AD. Usually the range is 30 to 33. But 30 is a nice round year, and that's the most popular year, so let's just take that. Now, if you ask the average Christian, what's the basis for believing this is true, and all these other wonderful things about this person's life? The average Christian says something like this. Well, my argument starts here with the Gospel of Mark, about 65 or 70 AD. And then Matthew, about 80. Luke, about 85. And John, about 95. And I mean, look, subtract 30 from 95. This is just 65 years after the fact. That's pretty close. You know, we still have people. I heard about a guy a few years ago who was writing his memoirs of World War II, and it was 50 years after the fact. I mean, you know, 65 isn't out of the question. And this is 55, and this one's 50, and this one's only 40. Now, that's the average Christian argument. And then you have to get into a long discussion about the nature of the Gospels. And actually, the Gospels are having a comeback today in some of the literature. And I think some of this argument works. I think it's a little harder to pull it off. In fact, a leading New Testament scholar from St. Andrews University published a book that was long awaited. I think it moved up to number 33 on the book chart, and the book hadn't even come out yet. And it was written by Richard Bauckham, one of the best-known New Testament scholars in the world, at St. Andrews. Big book, about 500 pages, and it's called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he brings out this mothball-eaten argument that hasn't been brought up in mainline scholarship for decades. And he argues that there's eyewitness testimony behind the Gospels, and these guys, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, he argues these guys are in the right place at the right time. So we can do ancient history with these guys. But the argument I'm going to use tonight, the starting point is going to be where the vast majority of New Testament scholars are going to go. And it doesn't make a difference, liberal, conservative, or in between. They're going to start with the Apostle Paul. Paul's sort of the hero of critical scholarship today. And the reason he is, I mean, for example, I'll take the atheistic philosopher Michael Martin. Martin says, we start with Paul because Paul is the only one that we're sure was an eyewitness of these things. In fact, Martin says, do you think this is a major point to concede? But Martin says, Paul is the only one who gives eyewitness testimony. He's the only one who saw the risen Jesus. You go, wait a minute, you can't say that. You're an atheist. But that's what he says. Paul is the only one who gives evidence. Now, what did we do with Paul? Jesus dies about 30 AD. Paul writes most of his epistles about 55 AD, well, if that's 65, I guess. 55 AD and a little bit over here. Now, most critical scholars do not If you go down to the left,